The morning of November 17th, 1965, began with relief. At Landing Zone X-ray, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's exhausted men had held, against overwhelming odds, against human wave assaults that crashed against their perimeter through 3 days and 2 nights, they had held. But the Battle of Drang was not over. For another American battalion marching through that jungle, the worst was yet to come. What happened at a small clearing called Landing Zone Albany would become the deadliest single engagement for American forces in the entire Vietnam War up to that point, a nightmare that the Army would spend years trying to forget. On the morning of November 17th, fresh troops from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry arrived at X-ray to relieve Moore's battered command. The survivors of the 3-day battle were finally going home, but Colonel Tim Brown, the 3rd Brigade commander, had one more mission. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, the sister unit to Moore's own, was ordered to sweep northwest through the jungle and secure a second clearing designated Landing Zone Albany, about 2.5 miles away. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade commanded the 2nd Battalion. Unlike Moore, who had landed his men directly into the hornet's nest, McDade was told to march overland, on foot, through dense jungle, in single file. It was a recipe for disaster. At 9 o'clock that morning, the column began moving out. Alpha Company led, followed by the headquarters element, then Charlie Delta, and finally Alpha Company of the 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry bringing up the rear. 500 men stretched through the jungle in a column nearly 550 meters long, in terrain so thick that soldiers could barely see the man in front of them. They had been warned. Reconnaissance pilots reported enemy movement in the area, but the battalion pressed on. By noon, the lead elements had reached the edge of Landing Zone Albany, a small clearing in the elephant grass. McDade called a halt to coordinate the next move, and that's when the enemy struck. The North Vietnamese had been watching, tracking, waiting. When McDade halted his column, he had unknowingly stopped his men directly in the middle of a battalion of the 66th Regiment, who were themselves moving toward X-ray to reinforce their comrades. At 12:07 in the afternoon, the jungle exploded. Enemy soldiers rose from spider holes just meters away. There was no warning, no chance to form a perimeter. The fighting was immediate, intimate, and utterly chaotic. It was like a swarm of bees, one survivor remembered. They were everywhere. The North Vietnamese knew exactly what they were doing. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Hu An, had learned a crucial lesson at X-ray. American firepower was devastating at range. Artillery and airstrikes had shattered his assault waves. But at close quarters, the Americans couldn't use their biggest advantage without killing their own men. "Grab them by the belt buckle," An had ordered. "Fight so close that they cannot use their bombs and shells." At Albany, his men executed that doctrine perfectly. The fighting devolved into hand-to-hand combat. Men killed each other with bayonets, rifle butts, and bare hands. The screaming never stopped. The column had been cut into pieces. Small groups of Americans fought desperate isolated battles, unable to see or communicate with each other through the dense vegetation. Some men played dead, lying beneath the bodies of their fallen comrades as enemy soldiers moved through the grass, executing the wounded. Captain Joel Sugdinis of Alpha Company, 2nd of the 5th, tried to lead a rescue party into the kill zone. They were driven back. Helicopters arrived overhead but couldn't land. Pilots could hear the screaming and gunfire below, but the clearing was too hot and the combatants too intermingled to risk an extraction. For hours, the massacre continued. It took until nightfall for the fighting to subside. Artillery finally began falling on enemy positions, but only after most of the damage was done. When relief forces reached Albany the next morning, they found a scene of horror. Bodies lay everywhere, American and Vietnamese intermingled where they had fallen, killing each other. Of the roughly 400 American soldiers who had marched into that ambush, 155 were dead. Another 124 were wounded. Casualties exceeded 50%. Many of the dead were found shot at close range, executed where they lay. The Army's reaction to Albany was swift and quiet. While LZ X-ray was celebrated as a victory, a validation of air mobility doctrine, Albany was classified, studied, and largely buried. Lieutenant Colonel McDade was quietly transferred to a staff position. The tactical blunders that led to the ambush, the single-file march through hostile territory, the lack of flank security, the halt in the middle of enemy positions, were documented but rarely discussed publicly. For the men who survived, Albany became a wound that never fully healed. Decades later, survivors still woke screaming from nightmares of that tall grass. The Battle of Drang, both X-Ray and Albany, taught both sides lessons they would apply for the next decade. The Americans learned they could win with superior firepower, if they could bring it to bear. The North Vietnamese learned they could survive, even prevail, if they closed the distance and made the Americans fight in the jungle on their terms. The war would grind on for another 10 years, following the template set in that remote valley. An endless cycle of air assaults and ambushes, body counts and booby traps. Joseph Galloway, who had survived X-Ray and witnessed the aftermath of Albany, called it the battle that convinced Ho Chi Minh he could win. He was right. Today, the Drang Valley is quiet. The elephant grass still grows where 500 men walked into an ambush. The clearings called X-Ray and Albany have returned to jungle, but the names live on, carved into the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. 155 men who woke up that November morning expecting relief, who marched into tall grass and never came home. They were soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, the same regiment that had followed Custer to the Little Bighorn a century before. History, it seems, has a bitter sense